Picture this: May 1770, Versailles, Marie Antoinette, 14 years old, trembling in a massive bed while dozens of French courtiers wait just outside silk curtains. Ministers, nobles, even the king's grandfather, all listening, all waiting for proof that France's alliance with Austria just got sealed in the most intimate way possible. This wasn't some medieval tradition. This was the 1770s, and what happened in that bed wasn't private. It was politics, state business. And if you think that sounds insane, wait until you hear what came next. Hey everyone, welcome back. Grab your headphones, get comfortable, maybe turn off the lights. We're diving into something that'll make you grateful for privacy. If this kind of historical storytelling helps you wind down, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I love seeing how these stories travel around the world. Tonight we're exploring royal bedrooms where intimacy was impossible and wedding nights were public performances. Get settled. This one's wild. Marriage in the spotlight. The unconcealed nuptial. French kings couldn't even make love without an audience. That's not hyperbole. For 3 centuries, royal wedding nights were elaborate state ceremonies with protocols, witnesses, and political implications. Why? Because royal marriages weren't about love. They were diplomatic treaties sealed in flesh. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled, dissolving alliances worth millions of lives. So France developed the most invasive wedding tradition in European history. Privacy was a luxury no future king could afford. Under French law, everything the king did was public business. His morning routine, his meals, his prayers, definitely his marriage. Louis XIV didn't just say, "I am the state" as a power trip. It was literal truth. The king's body belonged to France. His fertility determined the kingdom's survival. Salic law meant only legitimate male heirs could inherit. No sons meant civil war, foreign invasion, thousands dead. So when a prince married, witnesses had to confirm consummation. The alternative was chaos. At Versailles, privacy simply didn't exist. 10,000 courtiers lived there under Louis XIV. The king dressed in public, ate in public, even used the toilet while conducting meetings. This wasn't just ceremony. It reinforced absolute power. Normal rules about modesty didn't apply to someone so far above ordinary humans, but it also meant he could never escape observation. Every moment was performance, including the moments we'd consider most intimate. Royal bedrooms were just another stage. The bedding ceremony followed precise protocols. After wedding feasts lasting 6 hours or more, newlyweds got escorted to separate chambers by their households. The bride's attendants were married noblewomen, often including the groom's mother. Think about that for a second. Your new mother-in-law supervising while you get undressed on your wedding night. They'd examine her linen shift for modesty, check for any physical defects. Nothing that might prevent consummation could be overlooked when kingdoms hung in the balance. Meanwhile, high-ranking nobles attended the groom. They'd undress him while offering advice about performance. Sometimes herbal concoctions, ground rhinoceros horn mixed with wine, ambergris for virility. The atmosphere was supposedly jovial, like a fraternity initiation. But imagine being a terrified teenager getting marriage tips from your father's ministers, while everyone knows you'll be performing under pressure in 20 minutes. These weren't experienced lovers. They were kids marrying strangers for political alliances. The terror was real. Then came the religious blessing. A bishop or cardinal would bless the actual bed with holy water and prayers specifically asking God for many sons. The language was remarkably explicit for a religious ceremony. Make the wife fertile. Ensure the husband's potency. Grant them male heirs. This wasn't subtle. The church needed to sanction what was about to happen, transforming a political alliance into a sacred sacrament. Biology and theology intertwined completely. God's will manifest through royal reproduction. Both parties got placed together in the marital bed, still surrounded by their households. The curtains would be partially drawn, not fully closed. Visual privacy, but sounds could still be heard. For the most important marriages, dozens of witnesses. For lesser royalty, maybe a dozen. They arranged themselves around the bedchamber with the most important witnesses closest to the bed. Then everyone waited, listening, breathing, the couple lying there knowing dozens of people were tracking every sound, every movement. What actually happened next depended on the couple's ages and terror levels. Many royal couples, especially young ones, just lay together briefly before the groom emerged to announce success. Whether anything actually occurred didn't always matter. The political requirement was presence in bed together in a state of undress. But when succession was urgent, a widowed king remarrying, an heir's long-awaited wedding, more proof might be demanded. The pressure was unimaginable. Proof came in several forms. The groom would emerge and announce consummation to assembled witnesses, sometimes display the bedsheet, though French court physicians understood not all virgins bled. More important was witness testimony. They had to swear they saw the couple placed in bed undressed, and heard sounds consistent with sexual activity. These witnesses later signed legal documents if the marriage's validity was ever questioned. Imagine having your wedding night performance legally documented. The psychological torture this created was real. The Duchesse d'Orléans wrote letters in the 1670s describing her horror, being undressed and examined by court ladies, placed in bed knowing dozens waited outside curtains. I thought I would die of shame. Every sound seemed amplified. I could hear them breathing, waiting. My husband was as terrified as I. We lay there frozen for what felt like hours. Her letters, written decades later, still conveyed the trauma. Marie Antoinette's wedding night in 1770 became infamous. She was 14, Louis Auguste was 15, reportedly awkward and uninterested. Contemporary accounts suggest the marriage wasn't consummated that night, nor for several years afterward. This created a succession crisis and political scandal. Marie Antoinette's letters reveal her humiliation at court physician examinations, everyone gossiping about the king's impotence or her sterility. Private struggles became state emergencies when royal reproduction was public business. Not every royal accepted this passively. Henri IV joked with attendants during his ceremony, diffusing tension through humour. Louis XIII was so shy his advisors practically forced him into bed with Anne of Austria. Terrified the succession would fail, some princes negotiated for slightly more privacy, accepting symbolic ceremonies where witnesses left sooner. But even these concessions were political statements about the groom's power. Every aspect was calculated, measured, documented. The practice declined during the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas about dignity spread. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's wedding was one of the last fully witnessed royal beddings in French history. After the Revolution, restored Bourbon ceremonies became purely symbolic. Napoleon refused any formal bedding ceremony in 1810, considering it beneath a modern emperor's dignity, though witnesses still waited outside to confirm consummation. Even emperors couldn't completely escape the performance. These ceremonies reveal how completely politics could override personal dignity when succession was at stake. Witnessing consummation prevented future legitimacy disputes, protecting kingdoms from chaos, but they also showed how dehumanizing monarchy was. Kings and queens bred like valuable livestock, their bodies instruments of state policy. The trauma was formative for many royals. Privacy became the ultimate luxury, something they could never have. Their suffering brought political stability, or tried to. Often it just created different chaos. The king's body, public property, and power. Picture this. You're the most powerful person in France. You can execute anyone with a word, start wars, end lives, but you can't take a private bath, can't eat breakfast alone, can't even use the toilet without someone watching, taking notes, reporting back to foreign ambassadors about your bowel movements. This was French royalty. Absolute power, zero privacy. Every single thing you did, political. Every breath, every meal, every moment in bed with your wife. All of it watched, all of it documented, all of it belonged to France. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. Louis XIV didn't just say this, he lived it. The king's body wasn't his own, it was France's most valuable asset. His heartbeat was the nation's pulse. His fertility determined the kingdom's future. His health was a matter of international importance. Foreign spies literally paid servants to examine his urine for signs of disease. When the king got sick, the stock market crashed. When he looked tired at dinner, ambassadors sent coded messages home. The man disappeared completely. Only the crown remained, wearing a human body like an expensive suit. Every morning, the lever ceremony. Dozens of nobles fighting for the honor to watch the king get dressed. First the chemise, then the shirt, each piece of clothing handed to him by someone of the exact right rank. Too high, and it's an insult to lower nobles. Too low, and you've disrespected the hierarchy. This took hours. Meanwhile, the king's standing there half naked, watching grown men nearly come to blows over who gets to hand him his left sock. All so France could see their king was alive, healthy, and still breathing. Meals were theatre, the grand couvert, the king eating dinner while hundreds watched from behind ropes like he's a zoo animal. Every bite analysed. Is he eating the Spanish ambassador's gift of oranges? Political signal, refusing the English wine, diplomatic crisis brewing, the way he chewed, who he spoke to between courses, whether he smiled at the Austrian Duchess, all of it decoded by professional court watchers and turned into intelligence reports. He couldn't even have indigestion privately. His stomach problems became matters of international concern, literally. But the wedding night, that's where this surveillance reached its peak of insanity. Royal marriages were diplomatic treaties written in flesh. The bride wasn't just gaining a husband, she was sealing an alliance between kingdoms that could mean war or peace. And everyone needed proof this alliance was, shall we say, properly sealed. So when Marie Antoinette married the future Louis XVI in 1770, she wasn't just getting married, she was consummating France's relationship with Austria in front of an audience. Think about that. Your most intimate moment, and there's a crowd outside the curtains listening. The bedding ceremony had rules, strict ones. After the wedding feast, the bride gets escorted to the chamber by married noblewomen. They undress her, check her over for defects, make sure she's wearing the right chemise. Nothing too modest, nothing too revealing. Meanwhile, the men are with the groom, getting him drunk, giving him aphrodisiacs made from ground rhinoceros horn, telling dirty jokes to boost his confidence, because apparently what a terrified teenage prince needed before his first time was peer pressure from drunk nobles making rhino horn cocktails. Then the bishop blesses the bed. Holy water, prayers for fertility, the whole thing. They're literally asking God to help the king get his wife pregnant in front of 40 witnesses. The prayers were shockingly explicit. Grant them many sons, make her womb fruitful, ensure his potency. This is a religious ceremony, and then they put the couple in bed together, draw the curtains just enough for visual privacy, and everyone waits, listening for sounds, for proof, for the moment when France's future gets secured through royal biology. Marie Antoinette described it decades later in letters that'll break your heart. She's 14, terrified, doesn't speak French well, gets undressed by strangers, examined like livestock, then placed in bed, knowing dozens of people are right there, breathing, waiting for her to perform. She wrote, "I thought I would die of shame. Every sound seemed amplified. I could hear them breathing, waiting. The future king was 15 and just as scared. They lay there frozen for hours before he did what was required. Can you imagine? Your wedding night, and it's a state function. But here's the thing that'll mess with your head. Sometimes they faked it. Young couples, scared out of their minds, would just lie there for a while, make some appropriate sounds, and the groom would emerge claiming victory. Because the political requirement wasn't actual sex, it was the appearance of consummation. Witnesses who could swear they saw the couple placed in bed together heard sounds that suggested success. The bed sheets might be displayed, though French doctors knew not all virgins bled. Politics over biology, theatre over truth. And if the queen didn't get pregnant fast enough, the surveillance got worse. Court physicians would examine her monthly, check for signs of pregnancy, signs of menstruation, signs of anything that explained why the alliance wasn't producing heirs. Marie Antoinette endured years of this. Doctors poking, prodding, asking intimate questions while courtiers gossiped about whether the king was impotent or she was barren. Her private medical issues became international scandals. Austria's ambassador literally sent coded reports about the Queen's menstrual cycle back to Vienna. Her body wasn't hers, it belonged to France. Some kings fought back in small ways. Henry IV joked with his attendants during his bedding ceremony, turning humiliation into comedy. Louis XIII was so shy his advisors practically forced him into bed with Anne of Austria because they were terrified he wouldn't consummate the marriage. Other princes negotiated for slightly more privacy, symbolic ceremonies where witnesses left sooner. But even these tiny rebellions were political statements about royal power. The king asking for privacy? That's news. That gets reported. That gets analysed by foreign courts looking for signs of weakness. Because an unconsummated marriage could destroy kingdoms. Henry VIII's sister Margaret married the King of Scotland. The marriage was supposed to create peace between England and Scotland. But if it hadn't been consummated, it could be annulled. The alliance would collapse. Years of diplomatic work wasted. So, yeah, privacy was a luxury France couldn't afford. Better to humiliate the royal couple than risk civil war. Better to turn their bedroom into a stage than let enemies claim the marriage was invalid. The king's dignity was sacrificed for the kingdom's stability. And when marriages did fail, political chaos. Louis VII's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine was annulled partly due to non-consummation claims, though they'd had daughters together. Eleanor married Henry II of England instead, bringing her vast lands with her. France lost a third of its territory because of bedroom politics. This is why witnesses mattered. This is why documentation mattered. This is why the French court turned the marriage bed into a legal proceeding with signed testimonies. Love had nothing to do with it. This was contract law, enforced through public humiliation. The practice started dying out in the 1700s. Enlightenment ideas about human dignity slowly penetrated even royal courts. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's wedding night was one of the last fully witnessed beddings in French history. Napoleon Bonaparte flat refused any bedding ceremony when he married Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810. He called it beneath an emperor's dignity. Though witnesses still waited outside his chamber to confirm consummation, old habits die hard when kingdoms are at stake. But the writing was on the palace walls. Think about the paradox here. Absolute power. The ability to execute anyone, start any war, change any law with a word. But you can't brush your teeth alone, can't choose your own clothes, can't make love to your wife without an audience taking notes. The French monarchy created the ultimate prison, golden bars, silk curtains, but still a cage. The king ruled everything except his own life. He owned France, but France owned him completely. Every breath belonged to the state. Even his heartbeat was public property. As you drift off tonight, think about that privacy you take for granted. Your bedroom is yours. Your body is yours. Your intimate moments belong to nobody but you. French royalty never had that. They traded privacy for power and discovered the exchange rate was brutal. Every moment performed, every private act scrutinized, every personal choice filtered through political calculation. They got absolute power over everyone else and lost all power over themselves. Maybe the real luxury was never the crown. Maybe it was just being left alone in the dark. Heirs of destiny, urgent successions. Salic law, two words that controlled the fate of French queens for centuries. Under this ancient legal principle, women couldn't inherit the throne, but they could create the men who would. The queen's womb became the kingdom's most valuable asset. Her monthly cycles were tracked by court physicians. Her morning sickness was celebrated by ministers. Every aspect of her fertility belonged to France, not to her. And if she failed, if she bore only daughters, or worse, nothing at all, the consequences weren't just personal, they were catastrophic. Think about this for a second. The queen's body wasn't her own, it was state property. Court doctors monitored her menstrual cycles, recorded every symptom, analysed every sign of potential pregnancy. Palace servants changed her bedsheets daily, examining them for evidence of fertility or its absence. Her diet was controlled, her exercise regulated. Even her emotions were managed, because stress might prevent conception. The woman who wore the crown was simultaneously the most powerful and most powerless person in the kingdom. Her biology determined France's future and her personal hell. Every pregnancy announcement sent shockwaves through European politics. Allied nations celebrated. Enemy kingdoms plotted. Diplomatic marriages were arranged or cancelled based on the Queen's condition. But here's the thing, pregnancy was just the beginning. She needed to carry to term. She needed to deliver a living child. She needed that child to be male. And she needed to survive the birth herself, to potentially produce more heirs. Each step was fraught with political consequences that stretched far beyond the nursery. One miscarriage could topple governments. One stillbirth could start wars. This is where it gets really invasive. The marriage had to be witnessed and consummated in front of court officials. Not just the ceremony, the wedding night itself. High-ranking nobles stood outside the royal bedchamber, listening for sounds that would confirm the union was physically completed. Why? Because an unconsummated marriage could be annulled, and if the marriage was invalid, any children born from it were bastards with no claim to the throne. The most intimate moments of a royal couple's life became matters of state security. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. The consummation requirement wasn't just about immediate heirs, it was about preventing future succession crises. Imagine this scenario: the king dies, leaving behind a son, but then someone claims the parents' marriage was never properly consummated, making the heir illegitimate. Suddenly you've got civil war brewing, multiple claimants to the throne, foreign powers choosing sides. The witnesses who stood outside that bedchamber weren't perverts, they were insurance policies. Their testimony could save or destroy a dynasty decades later. Every embarrassing detail served a brutal political purpose. Now picture being that queen. You're maybe 16 years old, married to a stranger, surrounded by foreign courtiers in a palace that feels like a gorgeous prison. Your wedding night performance gets reviewed by ministers of state. Your periods get tracked like military intelligence. Your body becomes a battlefield where international politics play out. And everyone's waiting, watching, hoping for signs that you're fulfilling your primary function. Not as a person, not as a ruler, as a breeding vessel whose success or failure could determine whether kingdoms rise or fall. The pressure was absolutely crushing. Marie Antoinette went 7 years without producing an heir, and it nearly destroyed her. Court physicians examined her regularly, searching for physical defects that might explain the delay. Gossips whispered about the king's impotence or her own barrenness. Foreign ambassadors sent coded reports about the succession crisis back to their governments. Every month that passed without a pregnancy announcement was another month of political instability. The Queen wasn't just failing personally, she was failing her adopted country, and everyone made sure she knew it. Miscarriages were political disasters. When Anne of Austria lost multiple pregnancies in the 1620s, Spain and Austria began questioning their alliance with France. What was the point of supporting a barren queen? Court physicians published detailed reports about the lost pregnancies, trying to prove the Queen could conceive, but explaining why she couldn't carry to term. These weren't private medical documents, they were state papers distributed to foreign courts. The most heartbreaking moments of a woman's life became diplomatic intelligence. Personal grief became public failure. Recovery wasn't just physical, it was political rehabilitation. The desperation for male heirs created an atmosphere of constant anxiety. Queens who produced daughters faced immediate pressure to try again. The daughter's birth was barely celebrated before courtiers started asking when the next attempt would begin. Some queens had 8, 10, even 12 pregnancies trying to produce a son. Each birth was a gamble with their lives, but the stakes were too high to stop trying. A single male heir wasn't enough. Infant mortality meant you needed backups. The Queen's body became a factory, expected to keep producing until the succession was secure. The court watched everything. Palace servants reported on the Queen's appetite, her sleep patterns, her mood changes. Did she seem nauseous in the mornings? Was she requesting specific foods? Had she asked for looser clothing? These weren't concerned friends. They were intelligence gatherers whose observations could move markets and shift military alliances. The Queen couldn't even vomit in private without it becoming a potential pregnancy rumour. Every bodily function was analysed for political significance. She lived under constant surveillance, her most basic biological processes transformed into matters of international importance. Regular physical examinations were mandatory. Court physicians, often accompanied by foreign medical observers, would examine the Queen's body for signs of fertility or pregnancy. These exams weren't gentle or private. They were thorough, invasive, and humiliating. The results were documented and shared with government ministers, sometimes even with foreign ambassadors. Medical details that should have remained between doctor and patient became state secrets. The Queen's cervix, her breast development, her overall physical condition, all of it was catalogued and analysed by men who saw her as a political asset rather than a human being. The terror of failure haunted every royal marriage. Queens who couldn't produce heirs faced divorce, annulment, or being set aside for a more fertile replacement. They watched other women at court, knowing that any one of them might become the king's official mistress if the Queen's fertility proved inadequate. Some queens desperately sought fertility treatments, herbal concoctions, religious pilgrimages, medical procedures that were often dangerous and rarely effective. They were trapped in a nightmare where their personal worth was measured entirely by their reproductive success, and failure meant not just personal disgrace, but political catastrophe. International alliances hung in the balance of each royal pregnancy. The marriage treaty between France and Austria meant nothing if Marie Antoinette couldn't produce French heirs with Austrian blood. Her fertility wasn't just personal, it was the physical manifestation of the diplomatic agreement. When she finally became pregnant, Austrian ambassadors celebrated like they'd won a military victory, because in a way they had. Every successful royal pregnancy was a diplomatic triumph. Every miscarriage was a potential treaty violation. The Queen's womb was where international politics literally took shape. The isolation was crushing. Queens couldn't confide their fears to anyone without those fears becoming palace gossip. They couldn't express doubts about motherhood without being seen as politically unreliable. They couldn't even grieve pregnancy losses privately, because those losses had international ramifications. Other royal women might understand, but they were often rivals or potential replacements. The Queen was surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, but utterly alone with her terror. Every smile had to be confident. Every public appearance had to suggest fertility and strength. The mask never came off. Time was the enemy. A queen's fertile years were limited, and everyone knew it. Court officials tracked her age with ruthless precision. Past 30 without multiple male heirs? The whispers started. Past 35? Panic set in. Backup plans were quietly discussed. Potential replacement wives were identified and evaluated. The biological clock wasn't just personal pressure, it was a countdown to political crisis. Every passing month reduced the Queen's value to the state. Every year brought her closer to being considered a failure, whose time had run out. Picture Marie Antoinette in 1778, finally pregnant after 8 years of marriage. The relief must have been overwhelming, but so was the new terror. Now she had to carry to term, deliver safely, hope for a son, and if this pregnancy failed like others before, she might not get another chance. She was 23 years old, and already palace observers were calculating how many more attempts she might have. The pressure that had crushed her for years would only intensify, because under Salic law, producing an heir wasn't the end of her obligations, it was just the beginning. Rituals unveiled, the protocols of the royal bedding ceremony. The wedding feast is finally over. 6 hours of diplomatic dining, forced smiles, and political theatre disguised as celebration. But here's the thing, the real ceremony is just beginning, because in the French court, getting married was the easy part. What came next? That's where things got truly invasive. The newlyweds are about to discover that even their most intimate moment belongs to the state. Every touch, every sound, every breath, it's all being monitored for political purposes. The escort begins, 2 separate processions forming in the Great Hall. The bride surrounded by married noblewomen, the groom by high-ranking male courtiers. They're not walking to privacy, they're walking to the most public private moment imaginable. Think about this for a second. You just spent your wedding day performing for hundreds of strangers. Now you're about to perform the most intimate act of your life for those same strangers. The marital chamber isn't a refuge, it's the final stage of your wedding performance. In one chamber, the bride faces her female attendants. These aren't servants, they're wives of dukes, countesses, sometimes the groom's own mother. Their job? Strip her down to her chemise. But it's not just undressing, they're examining her, checking for signs of illness, physical defects, anything that might prevent consummation. Imagine being 14 years old, terrified, and having powerful women you barely know inspecting your body like your livestock. Because honestly, that's basically what you were, royal breeding stock with a crown. The inspection isn't subtle. They're looking for rashes, deformities, anything unusual. The future of the kingdom might depend on this woman's body producing heirs. So they check everything, her skin, her posture, even examining the chemise to make sure it's appropriately modest yet accessible. These aristocratic women have done this before. They know exactly what they're looking for. The bride stands there trembling, while women old enough to be her grandmother evaluate her like a horse at auction. Royal dignity, not in this room. Meanwhile, the groom gets a completely different experience. The atmosphere with the men is almost festive. Ribald jokes, backslapping, advice that would make your grandmother blush. They're undressing him too, but there's laughter involved. Nervous energy channeled into humour. These are dukes and marquises, making crude jokes about wedding night performance. The groom might be 15 years old, marrying a complete stranger, but the men around him are treating this like some kind of fraternity initiation, anxiety masked by masculine bravado. Then come the aphrodisiacs, wine mixed with ground rhinoceros horn, herbal concoctions that cost more than most people's annual income, ambergris from whale intestines. Yeah, that's not making this sound more appealing. The nobles are convinced these substances will enhance virility. The groom probably just wants to disappear, but he drinks whatever they give him, accepts their advice about technique, pretends to laugh at jokes about royal performance anxiety, because refusing would suggest weakness, and weakness in a future king, unacceptable. Now comes the religious element. A cardinal or bishop enters the marital chamber. Holy water gets sprinkled on the bed, while prayers are recited for fertility. The language is surprisingly explicit for a church ceremony. Prayers asking God to make the wife fertile, ensure the husband's potency, grant them many sons. This isn't your typical wedding blessing. This is the church essentially asking divine intervention in the couple's sex life, because in royal marriages, even God needs to be involved in the bedroom politics. The couple gets placed in bed together, still surrounded by their attendants, still being watched. The curtains get partially drawn, not for privacy, but for the illusion of privacy. Visual barriers, but sound carries perfectly. Dozens of witnesses arrange themselves around the bedchamber. The most important nobles get spots closest to the bed. Everyone else crowds behind them. Picture this. You're in bed with your new spouse, and outside these thin curtains, half the French court is standing there, waiting, listening, taking mental notes for their reports. The waiting begins. Witnesses strain their ears for sounds that would indicate consummation is happening. Every creak of the bed, every whispered word, every shift in movement, it's all being analysed by people whose political careers might depend on this marriage producing heirs. Some couples, especially very young ones, just lie there frozen. Others try to perform just enough to satisfy the listeners. The psychological pressure must have been crushing. Your wedding night soundtrack isn't romance, it's the breathing of dozens of courtiers. Proof comes in different forms. The groom eventually emerges to announce success to the assembled witnesses. Sometimes there's a bedsheet display, though French court physicians understood that not all virgins bleed. More important was witness testimony, people who could swear they saw the couple placed in bed together undressed and heard sounds consistent with intimacy. These witnesses would later sign legal documents if the marriage's validity was ever questioned. Your wedding night wasn't private memory, it was legal evidence. The psychological trauma was real. The Duchesse d'Orléans wrote letters decades later, still describing her horror, being undressed, examined, then placed in bed, knowing dozens waited outside the curtains. She wrote about lying frozen with her equally terrified husband, every sound amplified, feeling like the breathing and waiting would never end. This woman was royalty, supposedly the most privileged person in France, but she described her wedding night like psychological torture, because honestly, that's what it was. Marie Antoinette's experience became infamous. 14 years old, married to 15-year-old Louis Auguste. The marriage wasn't consummated that night, or for several years afterward, creating a succession crisis and massive political scandal. She endured examinations by court physicians trying to determine why she wasn't pregnant. Everyone at Versailles gossiping about the king's impotence or her sterility. Her private struggle became a state emergency. Royal reproduction was never private. It was always public business with political consequences. Not everyone accepted this quietly. Henri IV joked with his attendants during his bedding ceremony, using humour to diffuse the tension. Louis XIII was so shy and resistant that advisors practically forced him into bed with Anne of Austria. They were terrified the marriage wouldn't be consummated and succession would fail. Some princes negotiated for slightly more privacy, symbolic ceremonies where witnesses left sooner. But even these small concessions were political statements about royal power and dignity. The practice started declining in the 18th century as Enlightenment ideas about privacy and human dignity spread to royal courts. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's wedding night was one of the last fully witnessed royal beddings in French history. After the Revolution, restored Bourbon ceremonies became purely symbolic, couple blessed and placed in bed, but witnesses departed immediately. Napoleon refused any formal bedding ceremony entirely. He considered it beneath a modern emperor's dignity. Progress, finally. Here's what this reveals about royal life. Political concerns completely overrode personal dignity when succession was at stake. These weren't prudish societies, they were desperately practical ones. Unstable succession meant civil war, foreign invasion, thousands of deaths. Witnessing consummation prevented future legitimacy disputes, but it also showed how dehumanizing monarchy could be. Kings and queens bred like valuable livestock, their bodies instruments of state policy rather than their own. The trauma was real and lasting. As you drift towards sleep tonight, be grateful your intimate moments belong to you alone. French royalty couldn't make love without an audience, couldn't fail without everyone knowing, couldn't escape producing heirs under public scrutiny. The ultimate luxury wasn't gold or jewels, it was privacy, something they never had. Their suffering bought political stability, or tried to. Rest well in your private space, knowing whatever you choose there is nobody's business but your own. A freedom most humans never knew. To bed with blessings. The sanctification of the nuptial chamber. Here's where things get really interesting. After all the pageantry, the feast, the diplomatic handshakes, the bride and groom are finally led to their chamber. But wait, they're not alone. A bishop stands ready with holy water, cardinal in full regalia, because apparently God needed to personally oversee royal consummation. This wasn't just about two people getting intimate. This was about sanctifying a political alliance through sacred ritual, making sure heaven approved of what was essentially a state merger. Picture this scene. Marie Antoinette, 14 years old, trembling. Louis Auguste, 15, equally terrified. They've been undressed by attendants, examined like prize cattle. Now they're led into this chamber where a high-ranking church official waits with ceremonial implements, holy water, sacred oils, prayer books specifically written for this moment. The church understood something crucial. If this marriage was purely political, it could be dissolved. But if God bless it, that changed everything. Theology was about to meet biology in the most explicit way possible. The bishop approaches the marital bed like he's consecrating an altar. Which, honestly, he kind of is. This bed represents the future of France. Every heir born here secures the dynasty. Every night of passion potentially prevents civil war. So he sprinkles holy water on the mattress, the pillows, even the bed frame. Each drop carries political weight. This isn't superstition, it's insurance, making sure no one can later claim this union lacked divine approval. God's signature on a diplomatic treaty written in flesh and blood, and hopefully royal children. Now comes the prayer. And trust me, this isn't your typical wedding blessing. The cardinal opens his book and launches into fertility prayers that would make a modern congregation blush. He's explicitly asking God for sons. Multiple sons. He's praying for the wife's womb to be fruitful, her cycles to be regular, her body to conceive easily. Then he turns to the husband, praying for virility, for potency, for the strength to fulfill his dynastic duty. Biology and theology intertwined in language so direct it's almost clinical. Listen to how specific these prayers get. The cardinal prays that the wife's body will open like fertile fields to receive the royal seed, that her womb will bear fruit like the vine of Jesse, producing kings to rule God's chosen nation. He prays the husband will be mighty as David, virile as Solomon, potent enough to plant dynasties in willing ground. This is sacred pornography, essentially. Religious language wrapped around the most basic biological imperative. Make babies. Specifically, make male babies. Make them quickly, and make them often. But here's what makes this ceremony brilliant. It transforms a purely political arrangement into something sacred. Everyone knows this marriage was negotiated like a trade agreement. Everyone understands these two young people barely know each other. But now God has blessed their union. The church has sanctified their bed. Any children born from this alliance aren't just political heirs, they're divinely appointed. The cardinal's prayers create a theological shield around what everyone recognizes as dynastic calculation. Heaven approves, so earthly criticism becomes blasphemy. The religious language gets even more explicit. Prayers asking God to make the royal loins fruitful and bless the sacred joining of flesh. Medieval theologians had developed an entire vocabulary for sanctified sexuality. They distinguished between base lust and holy procreation. Royal couples weren't just having sex, they were performing a sacramental act. Their pleasure served God's purpose. Their children fulfilled divine will. This wasn't indulgence, it was duty. Sacred duty that happened to involve the most intimate human acts, blessed by the highest church officials available. Think about the psychological impact on these young people. They're already terrified, overwhelmed by court protocol and diplomatic pressure. Now they're told their intimate moments serve God's plan. Their bodies belong not just to the state, but to heaven itself. The cardinal blesses their future children before they're even conceived. He prays for sons who will rule by divine right and royal blood. Every caress becomes a prayer. Every kiss advances God's kingdom. No wonder so many royal couples struggled with intimacy under this kind of spiritual surveillance. The timing of these blessings matters too. The church carefully chose the most fertile periods for royal weddings. Bishops consulted calendars, calculated the bride's cycles, even considered astrological charts to ensure divine favor. They wanted God's blessing to coincide with biological peak fertility, sacred timing meeting natural rhythms. The cardinal's prayers weren't just hopeful, they were strategically timed to maximize results. Heaven and earth working together to produce the next king of France. Theology and biology operating as a unified system for dynastic survival. Here's where it gets really intense. The cardinal doesn't just bless and leave, he stays for the entire ceremony. Witnesses pack the chamber. Church officials document everything, because this religious sanctification needs earthly verification. The bishop will later sign documents confirming he blessed this union. Witnesses will testify they saw God's representative consecrate this bed. If anyone later questions the marriage's validity or the children's legitimacy, the church can produce signed testimony. Sacred blessing backed by bureaucratic documentation. Even miracles need paperwork in royal courts. The prayers themselves reveal medieval understanding of reproduction. Cardinals prayed for quickening in the womb, for strong seed taking root in fertile ground. They understood conception as a mystical process requiring divine intervention. Medical knowledge was limited, so theology filled the gaps. These weren't just fertility prayers, they were medical consultations with God, asking heaven to override natural limitations, to ensure successful pregnancy despite royal inbreeding, poor nutrition and stress. Sacred intervention in biological processes that medieval science couldn't fully explain or control through earthly means. Some cardinals brought special relics for these ceremonies. Holy bones of saints known for large families, sacred oils from shrines associated with fertility miracles, religious artifacts believed to enhance conception. They'd place these relics around the marriage bed, creating a sacred circle of divine protection. The couple would be surrounded by holy objects while they tried to produce the next king. Imagine the pressure, not just political expectations, but spiritual ones. Saints literally watching over your most intimate moments, ensuring you fulfill God's dynastic plan. The language in these blessing ceremonies explicitly acknowledges the political stakes. Cardinals prayed for children who would secure the realm and please heaven. They asked God to strengthen the alliance through royal blood and bind nations through sacred offspring. Everyone understood this wasn't just about babies, it was about preventing war. A fertile royal marriage meant stable succession. Barren queens meant civil conflict. The cardinals' prayers literally asked God to prevent bloodshed through ensuring, other kinds of blood. Royal bloodlines that would unite kingdoms rather than divide them. What's fascinating is how these ceremonies evolved over time. Early medieval blessings were brief, almost perfunctory. By the 17th century, they'd become elaborate productions lasting hours. Cardinals would deliver entire sermons about marital duty and dynastic responsibility. They'd explain theological theories about conception, divine will, and royal bloodlines. The religious justification grew more complex as the political stakes increased. More theology to mask more calculation. Longer prayers to sanctify bigger lies. Sacred pageantry covering increasingly cynical dynastic mathematics where human beings became breeding stock. The aftermath reveals the ceremony's true purpose. Within hours, court officials would be calculating conception dates. Within weeks, physicians would be examining the Queen for signs of pregnancy. The Cardinal's blessing became the starting point for months of biological surveillance. Every meal monitored, every symptom analysed, every missed cycle investigated. The sacred blessing launched a medical and political campaign focused entirely on the royal womb. God's approval meant nothing without earthly results. Prayers needed to produce princes, or the entire theological justification for absolute monarchy started crumbling. This is the strangest part of absolute monarchy. Even the most intimate moments required divine approval and public witness. Even sacred blessings served political ends. The cardinal's prayers transformed royal marriages from diplomatic arrangements into holy mysteries. But underneath all the theology and ceremony, two terrified young people, thrust together by forces beyond their control, trying to fulfill impossible expectations while bishops and courtiers watched from the shadows. Sacred ritual masking very human vulnerability. Divine blessing covering very earthly fear. Heaven sanctifying what was essentially elaborate, expensive, religiously sanctified breeding programs. Witnessing the unseen, the bedding ritual in progress. Here's where things get really uncomfortable. The bride and groom are now in the marital bed. The curtains, they're drawn, but not all the way. Think of it like a theatre curtain pulled halfway. You can't see the actors clearly, but you know they're there. You can hear every whisper, every movement, every sound. And standing around that bed, anywhere from 12 to 40 witnesses, depending on how important this marriage is politically, all of them waiting. The curtain arrangement was deliberate. Heavy silk or velvet drapes, pulled to create what they called modest concealment. You could see shadows moving behind the fabric, silhouettes, but faces were obscured. The idea was to preserve some dignity, while still providing proof. Think about that for a second. They designed furniture specifically for witnessed intimacy. These beds had special curtain systems, multiple layers, some pulled completely closed, others left strategically open. Royal carpenters built confession booths for newlyweds. Who got to watch depended on rank. For a future king marrying, the entire inner circle, ministers of state, the Queen Mother, high-ranking nobles, foreign ambassadors sometimes. We're talking 30 or 40 people crammed into a bedroom. For lesser royalty, maybe a dozen, but never fewer than 6 witnesses. Never. Because if something went wrong later, if someone questioned the marriage's validity, you needed sworn testimony from people who actually saw the couple placed together in bed. Here's what might surprise you. Actual consummation wasn't always required that first night. Shocking, right? Especially for young couples, 14, 15 years old, terrified out of their minds. Sometimes they'd just lie there for 20 minutes. The groom would emerge, announce success, and everyone would pretend that settled matters. The political requirement was presence in bed together in a state of undress. Everything else could wait until they were ready. But, and this is a big but, when succession was urgent. Different story entirely. If the king was older, remarrying after his first wife died, if there was political pressure to produce heirs immediately, if foreign alliances hung in the balance, then the witnesses expected proof, real proof. The groom couldn't just emerge after 10 minutes claiming victory. They needed to hear sounds, see evidence. The sheets would be examined the next morning by court physicians. The sounds they listened for. Yeah, this is awkward to talk about, but it's history. Breathing changes, movement of the bed frame, whispered conversations between husband and wife, sometimes crying, which could mean consummation or just terror. The witnesses weren't perverts. Well, most weren't. They were politicians doing their jobs, ensuring the marriage that just cost the treasury millions of livres would actually produce the heirs it was designed to create. Picture this scene. 40 courtiers standing in a royal bedchamber at midnight. Some holding candles, others whispering. The most important witnesses closest to the bed. Lesser nobles pushed toward the walls. Everyone's straining to hear something, anything, that would confirm the alliance between France and Austria or Spain was sealed. And behind those curtains, 2 terrified teenagers who'd met 3 days ago, trying to figure out what they're supposed to do while dozens of people listen. The hierarchy was visible even here. The Queen Mother might stand right beside the bed. Foreign ambassadors got positions near the foot. Ministers of state formed a second ring, Lesser courtiers were pushed back toward the door. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood that what they witnessed tonight might be referenced in treaties, succession documents, annulment proceedings decades later. This wasn't entertainment. This was state business conducted in the most intimate setting imaginable. Some couples found ways to cope with the pressure. Henry IV joked with his attendants throughout the entire ceremony, made everyone laugh, diffused the tension. Others, like Louis XIII, were so paralyzed by shyness they could barely function. His advisors literally had to coach him through the process while witnesses waited outside. Marie Antoinette later wrote that she felt like she was performing on stage, except the audience was invisible, and the script was, well, there was no script. The psychological pressure was crushing. Every royal memoir from this period mentions wedding night trauma, not just from the physical intimacy, but from knowing that failure would be public knowledge by morning. If the marriage wasn't consummated, everyone would know. Court gossips would spread the news. Foreign diplomats would report back to their kings. The couple's private struggles would become international political incidents. No pressure, right? When things went wrong, and they often did, the consequences were massive. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI didn't consummate their marriage for 7 years. 7 years. The entire French court spent that time speculating about the king's impotence, the queen's fertility, possible annulment. Foreign courts questioned whether the Austrian alliance would hold. Court physicians examined both of them repeatedly. Their private medical issues became matters of international diplomacy. The evidence gathering was methodical. Witnesses would later sign sworn statements about what they observed, the exact time the couple was placed in bed, how long they remained together, any sounds or movements they detected, whether the groom emerged looking satisfied. These documents went into royal archives. Some still exist today, legal evidence from people's wedding nights, filed away like tax records, because that's what they were, proof that the state's investment in this marriage was valid. The bed itself told a story the next morning. Court physicians would examine the sheets, not just for blood, though that was part of it. They looked for other signs of sexual activity. This wasn't medieval superstition. These were educated men applying what they understood about human biology to questions of political succession. The bed sheets from royal wedding nights were preserved as evidence. Some were kept for decades, just in case the marriage's legitimacy was ever questioned. What's really insane is how routine this became. For the witnesses, it was just another court ceremony. They'd attend dozens of these over their careers. Royal cousins, foreign princesses, political marriages. After a while, the shock wore off. They'd stand there chatting quietly about other court business, while two people tried to be intimate 3 feet away. The normalization of this invasion of privacy shows how completely political concerns had overtaken basic human dignity. Some grooms tried to game the system. They'd emerge after just a few minutes, clothes disheveled, claiming success whether anything had happened or not. The witnesses usually accepted this performance if the political stakes weren't too high, but when succession was critical, when foreign alliances hung in the balance, they demanded more convincing evidence. The performance had to be believable. The future of kingdoms literally depended on what happened behind those partially drawn curtains. Think about what this moment represents: the absolute intersection of public and private, the complete surrender of personal intimacy to state necessity. Two people who barely know each other, trying to be vulnerable and tender, while dozens of politicians listen for proof that their country's alliance is consummated. It's the most human moment possible. Sex, fear, tenderness, conducted under the most inhuman circumstances imaginable. And somehow, occasionally, real love managed to grow from this twisted beginning. Loud and clear, the audible proof of consummation. Picture this nightmare scenario. You're 15 years old, terrified, lying in bed with a stranger while dozens of people wait outside the curtains. They're not just waiting for you to fall asleep, they're listening, for sounds, for proof, for the auditory confirmation that France's alliance with Austria just got sealed in the most intimate way possible. Because in royal France, your wedding night wasn't about love or even lust. It was about witnesses who needed evidence to sign legal documents. The groom's announcement was everything. After whatever happened or didn't happen behind those curtains, he had to emerge and declare to the assembled witnesses that the marriage was consummated. This wasn't a casual "yeah, we're good." This was a formal proclamation with legal weight. Picture young Louis Auguste, future Louis XVI, stepping out of bed at 15 years old, having to announce to court officials that he'd just become a man. The words themselves became part of the official record. Sometimes the announcement wasn't enough. For the most politically crucial marriages, the groom might have to exhibit the bedsheet. Yeah, you heard that right, physical evidence. But here's what's fascinating about France. They were actually less obsessed with blood than you'd expect. Unlike Spain or England, where virgin blood was considered essential proof, French court physicians understood that not all women bled during first intercourse. They were weirdly progressive about female anatomy, while being completely barbaric about privacy. The auditory element was crucial. Witnesses positioned themselves strategically around the bedchamber, close enough to hear but far enough to maintain some semblance of decency. They listened for movement, for sounds, for anything that suggested actual intimacy was occurring. Marie Antoinette later wrote about hearing them breathing outside the curtains, knowing they were straining to catch every sound. The psychological torture was real. Every creak of the bed, every whispered word became evidence for or against the marriage's validity. Court records from the 1660s describe witnesses taking notes, actual notes, about what they heard and when. The Marquis de Sourchy kept detailed journals of royal bedding ceremonies, recording times, sounds, and the groom's exact words upon emerging. These weren't gossipy diary entries, they were legal documents that could determine the fate of kingdoms. If the marriage was later contested, these witness accounts would be presented as evidence in court. Talk about performance anxiety. The witnesses themselves had specific roles. The highest-ranking nobles stood closest to the bed. Lower-ranking courtiers formed outer circles. Everyone had a designated position, a specific responsibility for what to observe and remember. Some were assigned to listen for the bride's voice, others for movement of the bed itself. The Duchesse d'Orléans described feeling like a specimen under examination by physicians, because essentially, that's exactly what was happening. Royal bodies weren't private property. What they were listening for was surprisingly specific, not just general sounds of activity, but particular indicators that actual consummation was occurring. Contemporary accounts mention listening for changes in breathing patterns, specific types of movement, even the bride's reaction to, well, you get the idea. Court physicians had actually trained some witnesses to recognize authentic sounds versus performed ones, because yes, some couples faked it. The pressure to produce evidence sometimes led to elaborate theatrical performances. The time element added another layer of pressure. Witnesses expected consummation to occur within a reasonable time frame. Too quick, and questions arose about the groom's experience or consideration for his bride. Too long, and people wondered if there were difficulties. Court observers actually timed these encounters. The ideal duration was apparently between 15 and 30 minutes, based on surviving journals. Imagine having your most intimate moments judged by their duration by a room full of political officials. When Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste's wedding night went silent, that created a crisis. Contemporary accounts describe witnesses waiting for hours, hearing nothing but whispered conversation. The groom never emerged with the triumphant announcement. No sound suggested consummation had occurred. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was a potential diplomatic disaster. Austria's alliance with France hung in the balance. The whispers started immediately and continued for years until the marriage was finally consummated. The failed consummation attempts became court gossip that reached international levels. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments about the French succession crisis. Letters between European courts discussed Louis Auguste's apparent impotence and Marie Antoinette's frustration. What should have been the most private struggle became public knowledge across Europe. The couple's bedroom troubles literally affected international relations and trade agreements. Privacy wasn't just impossible, it was politically dangerous. Some grooms tried to game the system. Henry IV was famous for his theatrical performance during his own bedding ceremony, complete with exaggerated sounds and dramatic announcements. He understood that successful consummation wasn't just about biology, it was about convincing an audience. Court records suggest he actually coached his bride on what sounds to make and when. They turned their wedding night into a carefully orchestrated performance designed to satisfy witness expectations. The psychological impact on the couples was devastating. Surviving letters reveal the lasting trauma. The Duchesse d'Orléans wrote decades later about still having nightmares about her wedding night. about the feeling of being listened to and judged during the most vulnerable moment of her life. Many royal couples reported that the witnessed consummation made physical intimacy difficult for years afterward. The public violation of their wedding night poisoned their private relationship. Failed announcements had serious consequences. If the groom couldn't declare successful consummation, the marriage could be annulled. This meant not just personal embarrassment but complete diplomatic failure. Treaties would be voided. Alliances would collapse. The couple's families would face international humiliation. So some grooms lied. They emerged and made the required announcement even when nothing had happened, hoping to buy time while figuring out the actual consummation later. The pressure made honest evaluation almost impossible. The witness signatures were legally binding. After hearing the announcement and any sounds they deemed relevant, witnesses would sign documents affirming that consummation had occurred in their presence. These signatures carried the same weight as testimony in court. If anyone later challenged the marriage's validity, these witness accounts would determine whether heirs were legitimate, whether alliances held, whether kingdoms survived intact. A wedding night became a legal proceeding with sworn testimony from court officials. By the 1770s, even French courtiers were questioning the practice. Enlightenment ideas about human dignity and privacy were seeping into royal circles. Some witnesses expressed discomfort about their role in these ceremonies. Letters from the period reveal nobility, wondering whether political necessity justified such intimate violation. The practice was becoming harder to defend philosophically, even as it remained politically essential. The old justifications were starting to crumble under new ideas about individual rights. The audible proof of consummation represented the complete abolition of privacy for French royalty. Every sound, every movement, every whispered word became state business requiring witness testimony and legal documentation. The marriage bed transformed into a courtroom where intimate success or failure would be judged, recorded, and potentially used as evidence in future political disputes. Their most private moments became the most public performances of their lives. No luxury could compensate for such exposure. Aftermath of shame, the personal testimonials. The ceremony's over. The witnesses have gone home. The political theatre has ended. But for the newlyweds, that's when the real trauma begins. What nobody talks about is what happened after those curtains closed, after the crowds dispersed. The letters, the diaries, the private confessions that reveal just how devastating this public humiliation really was. These aren't statistics or political analyses. These are human beings trying to process what just happened to them. We're about to read actual words from actual people who lived through this nightmare, and I'm warning you, some of this is hard to hear. These women were teenagers mostly, scared kids who just had their most intimate moments turned into state spectacle. Their own words tell us everything we need to know about the psychological cost of keeping dynasties alive. Let's start with the most famous testimony we have. The Duchesse d'Orléans, Elizabeth Charlotte of Bavaria, married in 1671, 24 years old, which made her practically ancient by royal bride standards. Her letters home to Germany are brutal. She writes, "I thought I would die of shame. This woman, who had become one of the most outspoken personalities at Versailles, was completely broken by her wedding night, and she never got over it." Elizabeth Charlotte keeps writing about it. Decades later, every sound seemed amplified. I could hear them breathing, waiting. Think about that image. You're lying there, practically naked, with your new husband who's basically a stranger, and you can literally hear dozens of people breathing on the other side of those curtains, waiting for you to perform. She says they lay there frozen for what felt like hours. But here's what gets me about her letters. She doesn't just describe the fear, she describes the anger. 20 years later, she's still furious. "My husband was as terrified as I." She realizes they were both victims, two scared people being used as political instruments, and she hated everyone who put them through it. The attendants, the witnesses, the whole system that treated them like breeding animals. Other testimonies are just as devastating. Marie Antoinette's letters to her mother Maria Theresa reveal a different kind of trauma. She was 14, remember? Her letters talk about being examined by court physicians when she didn't get pregnant right away. Imagine being a teenager and having doctors poke around your body while everyone at court gossips about whether you're broken. The public humiliation just never ended. Some women describe physical symptoms, panic attacks during court functions, nightmares about being watched. One Spanish princess who married into the French court in 1679 wrote about having to excuse herself from dinner parties because she'd suddenly feel like everyone was staring at her body, evaluating her fertility. The trauma wasn't just about one night. It rewired how they saw themselves and their bodies. What's heartbreaking is how many of these women blame themselves in their letters. They write about failing their duty, disappointing their families, not being brave enough, like, no, you were children thrown into an impossible situation, but the system was designed to make them feel responsible for their own violation. If you couldn't handle it gracefully, that was your weakness, not the system's cruelty. The immediate aftermath was often the worst part. One memoir from a lady in waiting describes how new royal brides would spend days after their wedding barely speaking, refusing to eat, crying when anyone approached them. These weren't spoiled princesses having tantrums. These were traumatized teenagers who'd just been publicly violated in the name of diplomacy, and everyone around them just acted like this was normal. Some developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD symptoms: hypervigilance about who was watching them, panic when doors opened unexpectedly. One duchess wrote about checking under her bed every night for years, terrified someone might be hiding there. The bedroom had become a place of public performance, not private safety. That sense of violation followed them everywhere. Even their most private spaces felt compromised. How did they cope? Some threw themselves into court life, becoming almost aggressively public. If privacy was impossible, they'd control the performance. Others withdrew completely, claiming illness to avoid social functions. Elizabeth Charlotte chose anger. Her later letters are full of vicious gossip about the courtiers who witnessed her humiliation. Revenge through words. It was one way to reclaim some power. Religion became a refuge for many. Not the public ceremonies that blessed their violated bodies, but private prayer, personal relationships with God that nobody could witness or judge. Some of the most moving testimonies describe finding peace in chapel corners, in early morning prayers, in moments when they could finally be alone with their thoughts and their God without anyone watching. The men's testimonies are fewer, but just as revealing. Young princes write about pressure to perform, about feeling like failures if they couldn't function, with dozens of people listening. One Dauphin's memoir describes vomiting from anxiety before his wedding night. Another talks about pretending everything was fine while feeling completely humiliated. The system damaged everyone involved, just in different ways. Some princes found ways to rebel quietly. Henry IV joked his way through the ceremony, diffusing tension with humour. Louis XIII negotiated for shorter witness periods. Small acts of resistance that gave them tiny scraps of dignity back. But even these small victories required immense political capital. Most just endured it silently, then spent years dealing with the psychological aftermath. What strikes me most is how these testimonies reveal the human cost of political stability. Every alliance sealed in a royal bedroom came with a price paid in trauma, humiliation, and psychological damage. These weren't abstract political calculations. They were real people, often children, being sacrificed for the theoretical good of the state. And they knew it. Their letters make that painfully clear. The testimony that haunts me most is from a minor German princess married to a French duke in 1702. She wrote, "I am no longer myself. I am what they made me into." That's the real aftermath. Not just shame or trauma, but the loss of self. The system didn't just violate their bodies. It erased their identities, turning them into political instruments who happen to have human feelings. Marie Antoinette, The Frustrating Union, May 16, 1770. Versailles. Marie Antoinette is 14 years old, trembling in her wedding dress. In a few hours she'll be stripped naked by court ladies, blessed by a cardinal, and placed in bed with her 15-year-old husband, while dozens of nobles wait just outside the curtains. They're listening for sounds, waiting for proof, because this isn't just a wedding night, it's a diplomatic treaty sealed in flesh, and what's about to happen will haunt both of them for years. The French court had turned marriage into theatre. Every royal wedding night followed the same brutal script. After hours of feasting and ceremony, the real performance began. Noble ladies would undress the bride down to her chemise, examining her for any defects. Meanwhile, high-ranking men attended the groom, offering wine mixed with supposed aphrodisiacs, ground rhinoceros horn, ambergris. The atmosphere was jovial among the men. For the terrified teenagers about to perform, pure nightmare, because privacy was a luxury no future king could afford. Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess, sent to France as a political pawn. Her job? Produce male heirs to cement the alliance between Austria and France. She barely spoke French, had never been alone with a boy, and now she's being prepared like a sacrifice. Court ladies checking every inch of her body for imperfections. They're whispering instructions she doesn't understand. Her mother's letters had prepared her for duty, not this. The humiliation hadn't even started yet, and she's already breaking. Louis August, future Louis XVI, was just as terrified. 15 years old, painfully shy, more interested in locks and hunting than girls. The court nobles are slapping his back, making crude jokes, giving him advice he doesn't want to hear. He's never even kissed a girl. Now he's supposed to perform the most intimate act of his life with strangers listening. The weight of the crown, the alliance with Austria, the future of France, all resting on what happens in the next hour. The bedchamber is ready. Bishop blesses the bed with holy water, praying specifically for fertility, multiple sons, the groom's potency. This isn't subtle religious ceremony, it's explicitly about sex and reproduction. Marie Antoinette and Louis are placed in bed together, both trembling. The curtains are drawn, but not fully. Dozens of witnesses arrange themselves around the room. Ministers, courtiers, even the king's grandfather. They're waiting for sounds, for proof, for the groom to emerge and announce success. The political pressure is crushing. This isn't just young love, it's international diplomacy. If the marriage isn't consummated, it can be annulled. Years of negotiations between Austria and France wasted. The alliance against Prussia and England collapsed. Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa, is waiting for confirmation from Vienna. The French ministers need proof this marriage is real. Two terrified teenagers are carrying the weight of European politics on their wedding night. And everyone knows it. Behind those curtains, nothing happens. Louis tries. Marie Antoinette endures. But he's terrified, inexperienced, and the pressure is overwhelming. She's in pain, confused, humiliated. After what feels like hours, he emerges from the bed and announces to the waiting crowd that the marriage has been consummated. It's a lie. Everyone suspects it's a lie. But the political theatre requires it. The witnesses sign documents. The alliance is supposedly sealed. But the real problems are just beginning. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. Still no pregnancy. In royal marriages, this isn't private struggle, it's public crisis. Court physicians start asking questions. Marie Antoinette's periods are tracked like state secrets. Every month she doesn't conceive, the whispers get louder. Is she barren? Is Louis impotent? The Austrian alliance depends on an heir. Without one, Marie Antoinette is just an expensive foreign princess taking up space. The clock is ticking, and everyone can hear it. The gossip at Versailles is vicious. Courtiers have nothing better to do than speculate about the royal bedroom. Some say Louis is physically incapable. Others blame Marie Antoinette's foreign blood. The cruel jokes spread from the palace to Paris coffeehouses. Political pamphlets mock the impotent Dauphin and his barren Austrian wife. What should be private marriage struggles become public entertainment. Every failed month makes them weaker politically. Their enemies are watching, waiting for the marriage to collapse completely. Marie Antoinette's letters to her mother are heartbreaking. I am so humiliated, Mama. The ladies examine me constantly. They discuss my body like I'm livestock. She describes the monthly disappointment, the pressure from Louis's family, the whispered consultations with physicians. Everyone treats me like I'm failing France by not conceiving. I don't understand what's wrong with us. These aren't the complaints of a spoiled princess. They're the desperate pleas of a teenager trapped in an impossible situation. 3 years pass. Still no heir. This is beyond embarrassing. It's becoming a succession crisis. Louis XV, the king, is aging. If Louis Auguste can't produce sons, the throne might pass to his younger brothers. The Austrian alliance grows shakier every month. Marie Antoinette's mother sends increasingly frantic letters. Habsburg family honor is at stake. European balance of power hangs on one couple's bedroom failures. 2 young people are drowning under pressure that would crush adults with decades of experience. The speculation gets darker. Pamphlets circulating in Paris openly mock Louis's manhood. They call him the lockmaker, who can't pick the right lock. Others suggest Marie Antoinette is secretly barren, that Austria sent defective goods to France. Some conspiracies claim the marriage is unconsummated by design, a Habsburg plot to weaken France from within. None of this is true, but truth doesn't matter. Public perception is becoming reality, and their reputation is crumbling with every childless month. The medical examinations are the worst humiliation. Court physicians examine Marie Antoinette like a broodmare, checking for defects that might prevent conception. They interview Louis about his attempts, his techniques, his physical responses. Private doctors suggest positions, timing, dietary changes. Every intimate detail becomes medical consultation. Marie Antoinette writes to her mother about feeling like an animal being studied. The most personal aspects of marriage have become matters of state medicine. There's no escape from scrutiny. 7 years. 7 years of failed attempts, medical interventions, public speculation, and private agony. Louis finally seeks surgical consultation for what might be a physical condition preventing consummation. Marie Antoinette endures increasingly invasive medical examinations. Their marriage becomes a case study in royal dysfunction. Meanwhile, political enemies use their childlessness as proof of divine displeasure with the monarchy. What started as a diplomatic alliance has become a symbol of royal incompetence. The damage goes far beyond their bedroom. The political implications multiply like infections. Opposition pamphlets use their childless marriage as evidence that God disapproves of the monarchy. Foreign diplomats report back to their capitals that the French royal line might be ending through incompetence rather than revolution. Marie Antoinette's reputation suffers permanently. Even when they eventually do have children, the years of public humiliation have poisoned public opinion. The Austrian woman becomes a scapegoat for everything wrong with France. Their bedroom failures help destabilize a kingdom. The marriage that began with such hope ends in tragedy. When Marie Antoinette finally bears children, it's too late to repair the damage. Years of public mockery have made her a symbol of foreign corruption and royal excess. The failed wedding night of 1770 echoes through their reign, undermining every political decision. Their private struggles became public theatre, and the audience never forgave the performance. Sometimes the most intimate failures have the most public consequences. 2 teenagers paid the price with their lives. Resistance in royalty, an affront to the old tradition. Not every French prince went quietly into that witnessed bedchamber. Some fought back in their own ways. Henry IV cracked jokes while being undressed by his attendants. Louis XIII practically had to be forced into bed with Anne of Austria. A few managed to negotiate smaller audiences or earlier witness departures. These weren't just personal preferences, these were political statements. Every concession meant something. Every joke was rebellion. Every negotiated privacy was a crack in absolute monarchy's facade. Here's what gets fascinating about royal resistance. It had to be subtle. You couldn't just refuse the ceremony entirely. That would invalidate your marriage, destroy diplomatic alliances, maybe even cost you the throne. So resistance became an art form, a carefully placed joke during the undressing, a negotiated modification to witness protocols, strategic delays that frustrated courtiers. These princes were walking a tightrope, showing just enough defiance to maintain some dignity without triggering a constitutional crisis. Henry IV. Now there was a king who understood how to handle impossible situations with humour. 1600. His wedding night with Marie de Medici. As his attendants began undressing him, offering the usual ribald advice and aphrodisiac concoctions, Henry started making jokes. Not nervous laughter, calculated comedy. He mocked the ceremonial wine mixed with ground rhinoceros horn, asking if they thought he needed magical assistance. His attendants were caught off guard. Was the king insulting their preparations or just being Henri? Henri's humour served multiple purposes. It relaxed the tense atmosphere. Everyone knew Marie de Medici was a political marriage, not a love match. It asserted his authority. He was controlling the mood, not being controlled by protocol. And it sent a message to the assembled witnesses. This might be a state ceremony, but Henry IV wasn't going to be intimidated by it. He'd play along with the requirements while making it clear he found some aspects ridiculous. Masterful political theatre disguised as casual jokes. But Henry's approach only worked because he was already established as king, confident in his power. Younger princes, future heirs, had less room to maneuver. They needed those alliances. They couldn't afford to offend diplomatic partners or court officials, so their resistance took different forms, more subtle, more desperate. Louis XIII's story shows what happened when a prince really didn't want to go through with the ceremony, but couldn't find a way out. Louis XIII, 1615, married to Anne of Austria for political reasons he barely understood. Contemporary accounts describe him as painfully shy, uncomfortable with the whole concept of marriage, let alone public consummation. As his attendants tried to prepare him for the bedding ceremony, Louis kept finding excuses to delay. He needed more wine. He wanted different clothes. He required additional prayers. His advisors realized the future king was stalling. The delay created a diplomatic crisis in miniature. Spanish ambassadors were waiting to witness the consummation that would seal France's alliance with Spain. Court officials had scheduled everything precisely: the feast, the blessing, the bedding ceremony. But Louis XIII just wouldn't cooperate. He wasn't openly refusing, which would have been treasonous. He was just being incredibly, frustratingly slow about everything. Passive resistance at its most maddening. His advisors were practically pulling their hair out. Finally, his chief advisor, the Duc de Luynes, essentially forced the issue. Not physically. You couldn't manhandle a king, even a teenage one, but through sheer persistence and political pressure, reminding Luynes that the kingdom's alliance with Spain depended on this marriage, that his mother Marie de Medici had negotiated this treaty for years, that hundreds of courtiers and foreign dignitaries were waiting. The weight of expectation finally overwhelmed Luynes' shy resistance. Even then, Louis XIII's performance in the bedchamber was minimal. Historical accounts suggest he spent just enough time in bed with Anne to satisfy the legal requirement for consummation, then emerged as quickly as possible. No lingering, no attempt at actual intimacy. Just the bare minimum to make the marriage valid and the alliance secure. His resistance had been defeated by political necessity, but he wasn't going to cooperate 1 second longer than required. Some princes managed more successful negotiations. Not elimination of the ceremony, that was impossible, but modifications that gave them slightly more dignity or privacy, smaller audiences, earlier witness departures, partial instead of complete undressing. These seem like tiny concessions, but they were actually significant political victories. Each modification required approval from the king, the bride's family, and diplomatic representatives. Getting any change meant extensive behind-the-scenes negotiation. The Duc d'Orléans, Louis XIV's brother, managed to negotiate a modified ceremony in 1661. Instead of dozens of witnesses remaining throughout, only 6 high-ranking officials would stay after the initial blessing. Instead of complete undressing, both parties would keep their shirts. Instead of waiting for sounds of consummation, witnesses would depart after confirmation that both parties were properly positioned in bed. These compromises took months to arrange and required Louis XIV's personal approval. Why did these modifications matter so much? Because they represented cracks in absolute monarchy's facade. If a prince could negotiate privacy in his bedchamber, what else might he negotiate? If royal bodies weren't completely public property, where did that privacy end? Court observers understood the implications immediately. Every concession granted to royal dignity was a precedent that might be cited later for other purposes. The personal became political because everything royal was political. Foreign diplomats paid close attention to these negotiations. A French prince who could modify his bedding ceremony might also modify treaty terms or succession protocols. Concessions granted for personal comfort suggested weakness in royal resolve or dangerous independence from traditional constraints. Spanish ambassadors filed detailed reports about witness numbers and ceremony durations, analyzing what French flexibility in bedroom protocols might mean for international agreements. Privacy became a diplomatic indicator. The resistance also revealed growing Enlightenment influence on royal thinking. Ideas about individual dignity, personal privacy, and human rights were seeping into court culture. Princes who negotiated for bedroom privacy were unconsciously applying philosophical concepts about personal autonomy to their own lives. They might not have read Locke or Voltaire, but the ideas were circulating among their tutors and advisors. Royal resistance to public consummation was part of broader cultural shifts toward individual rights. By the mid-1700s, even conservative court officials recognized that forced public consummation was becoming politically dangerous. Not just embarrassing, actually destabilizing. Young princes were threatening to refuse marriages entirely rather than submit to full witness requirements. Diplomatic partners were questioning whether such ceremonies were necessary for valid alliances. The practice that had once guaranteed royal legitimacy was starting to undermine it. Resistance was winning through accumulated pressure. The ultimate irony? Royal resistance to bedding ceremonies helped destroy the monarchy itself. Each successful negotiation for privacy weakened absolute power's theoretical foundations. If kings weren't completely public beings, if they had personal rights that trumped state requirements, then maybe they weren't divinely appointed after all. Maybe they were just humans with crowns. The bedroom rebellions that seemed so small were actually revolutionary acts. Privacy killed absolute monarchy, one modest concession at a time. End of an era, the declining practice. By the 1770s, something was shifting in French society. The Age of Enlightenment was spreading ideas about individual dignity, personal privacy, basic human rights. And these new ideas, they were starting to make the royal bedding ceremony look, well, barbaric. Even the French court, which had perfected the art of making everything public, was beginning to question whether watching teenagers consummate marriages was really necessary for political stability. The writing was on the wall. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were publishing essays about natural rights and human dignity. Their ideas were spreading through the salons of Paris, even reaching Versailles itself. Suddenly, educated nobles were asking uncomfortable questions. Why should anyone have to perform their most intimate moments for an audience? What kind of civilization treats its kings and queens like breeding animals? The intellectual foundation that had supported centuries of royal bedding ceremonies was crumbling. Marie Antoinette herself became a symbol of this change. After her traumatic wedding night in 1770, she never forgot the humiliation. Years later, as queen, she quietly discouraged the full ceremony for other royal marriages. She'd experienced firsthand what it felt like to be undressed by strangers, examined like livestock, then placed in bed knowing dozens of people waited outside the curtains. She didn't want anyone else to endure that psychological torture. Louis XVI, despite being king, was actually quite progressive about personal privacy. He hated the traditional royal routines that made everything public, the formal dressing ceremonies, eating in front of crowds, even using the toilet while conducting business. He tried to modernize court life, make it more humane. The bedding ceremony was one tradition he was quietly happy to see fade away. He understood how damaging it could be. But here's what's fascinating. Even as the ceremony was declining, French politics still demanded proof of royal consummation. So the court developed, let's call them workarounds. Instead of dozens of witnesses crowding the bedchamber, maybe just a few trusted officials would wait outside. Instead of examining bed sheets and demanding immediate proof, they'd accept the couple's word that the marriage had been consummated. Small changes, but they represented a huge philosophical shift. The French Revolution changed everything, obviously. When revolutionaries executed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in the 1790s, they weren't just killing individuals, they were destroying the entire concept of divine monarchy. The idea that royal bodies belonged to the state? Gone. The notion that kings were somehow above normal human dignity? Finished. Revolutionary France declared that all people, even former royalty, had inherent rights to privacy and personal autonomy. After Napoleon fell and the Bourbons returned to power in the 1810s, they faced an impossible task. How do you restore a monarchy that everyone now knows is just people, regular humans who happen to wear crowns? The restored royalty tried to bring back some traditional ceremonies, but they couldn't resurrect the old mindset. People had seen royal heads roll. The mystique was broken forever. So the Bourbon Restoration created what they called symbolic bedding ceremonies. The couple would be blessed by clergy, placed in the marriage bed by attendants, but then everyone would leave, immediately. They'd maintain the appearance of traditional royal protocol while acknowledging modern ideas about privacy. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offended fewer people than the old system. Political theatre pretending to be tradition. Napoleon Bonaparte represents the complete break with this tradition. When he married Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810, people expected some kind of bedding ceremony. After all, this was a major political alliance, the marriage that was supposed to legitimize Napoleon's empire and produce an heir. But Napoleon refused. Completely. No witnesses, no ceremony, no blessing of the marriage bed, just privacy. Revolutionary concept for royal marriage. Napoleon's reasoning was brilliant. He argued that modern emperors shouldn't need to prove their virility to courtiers. His legitimacy came from military victories and popular support, not from performing for nobles in a bedroom. He was creating a new kind of monarchy, one based on merit and achievement rather than bloodline and ancient ritual. The bedding ceremony belonged to the old world he was trying to replace. But even Napoleon couldn't completely escape royal reproduction politics. Officials still waited outside his chamber door on his wedding night, not to witness anything, just to confirm that the emperor and empress had, done what was necessary for the succession. They needed to know the marriage was consummated, but they didn't need to watch it happen. A subtle but important distinction that preserved both political necessity and human dignity. The end of royal bedding ceremonies reflects a broader change in how Europeans thought about power and privacy. Medieval people believed kings were fundamentally different from ordinary humans, closer to God, above normal rules about modesty and dignity. By the 19th century, even monarchists acknowledged that kings were just people doing a difficult job, people who deserved basic human rights, including the right to private, intimate moments. Medical knowledge played a role too. Court physicians were finally understanding that not all virgins bleed during first intercourse, that fertility problems have complex causes, that sexual performance anxiety can be made worse by pressure and observation. The old system of witness consummation wasn't just psychologically damaging, it was medically counterproductive. Privacy actually increased the chances of successful royal reproduction. Science supported dignity. Other European courts watched France's experience and learned from it. British royalty quietly abandoned their own bedding ceremonies decades earlier. Spanish and Austrian courts modified their traditions, reducing witnesses and shortening ceremonies. By 1850, no major European monarchy was still practicing full public bedding rituals. The French experience had shown everyone how destructive and unnecessary these ceremonies really were. Progress, finally. What's remarkable is how quickly centuries of tradition disappeared. In 1770, Marie Antoinette's witnessed bedding seemed normal, if unfortunate. By 1820, the idea of watching teenage royalty consummate marriages seemed barbaric and backwards. 50 years transformed a sacred state ceremony into an embarrassing historical curiosity. The Enlightenment didn't just change philosophy, it changed what people considered acceptable behavior toward other human beings. The end of royal bedding ceremonies marked the beginning of modern royal marriage, still political, still public ceremonies, but with private, intimate moments that belonged to the couple alone. Marie Antoinette's traumatic wedding night helped teach Europe that even queens deserved dignity. Her suffering wasn't meaningless if it helped ensure no future royal bride would endure the same humiliation. Sometimes progress comes through pain, teaching us what we should never do again. Legacy of trepidation, the power of the public eye. Marie Antoinette's letters to her mother, they still exist today. And when you read them, decades after her wedding night, the trauma just bleeds through the ink. She's writing about that moment when she was 14, terrified, placed in bed while courtiers waited outside the curtains. She calls it the most humiliating experience of my young life. This wasn't just a bad wedding night. This was systematic dehumanization dressed up as ceremony. Think about the psychology here for a second. You're a teenager, probably never been intimate with anyone, and suddenly you're expected to perform the most private act possible while knowing dozens of people are listening for proof. The Duchess of Orleans wrote that she could hear them breathing, waiting outside the curtains, every sound magnified, every moment of hesitation noted. Can you imagine trying to be intimate under those conditions? It's designed to be traumatizing. But here's what's really twisted about this whole system. The trauma wasn't a side effect. It was part of the point. Breaking down personal boundaries, making it clear that your body wasn't yours anymore. Henry IV joked during his bedding ceremony, but that was his way of coping with powerlessness. Louis XIII was so terrified his advisors literally forced him into bed with Anne of Austria. These weren't willing participants. They were breeding stock with crowns. The political math was brutal but simple. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. Years of diplomatic negotiations wasted. Alliances dissolved. Wars started over succession disputes. So they made sure consummation happened publicly, with witnesses who could testify in court decades later if needed. Your most intimate moment became a legal document. Your wedding night became evidence in future lawsuits. Privacy was a luxury that could destabilize kingdoms, so they eliminated it completely. The examination process was particularly dehumanizing. Before bedding, court ladies would strip the bride completely, checking for any physical defects that might prevent pregnancy. They'd examine her body like livestock at market. Meanwhile, the groom got herbal aphrodisiacs and advice from male courtiers, but both parties knew they were being prepared for performance, not intimacy. Their wedding night wasn't about love or even physical pleasure. It was about producing heirs on schedule. Marie Antoinette's case shows how this system created ongoing trauma. Her marriage wasn't consummated for 7 years. 7 years of court physicians examining her, courtiers gossiping about the king's impotence, foreign diplomats reporting back that the alliance might fail. She wrote to her mother about feeling like a broodmare who couldn't breed. The public scrutiny of her fertility became a constant source of humiliation and political vulnerability. Every royal pregnancy became a state event with international implications. Morning sickness was reported to foreign ambassadors. Miscarriages became diplomatic crises. The Queen's menstrual cycle was tracked by court physicians and reported to the King's Council. There was no private grief for lost pregnancies, no private joy for successful ones. Every biological function was public property, because the succession depended on it. Women weren't wives or mothers, they were reproductive vessels with political value. The witnesses weren't just observers, they were participants in the dehumanization. They had to stand there, listening, waiting for proof that the marriage was valid. Some were elderly advisors who'd witnessed multiple royal beddings over decades. Others were foreign diplomats representing allied kingdoms, all of them complicit in treating human beings like breeding animals, and they signed documents afterward, creating legal records of what they'd witnessed. Intimate moments became sworn testimony. The religious blessing made it even more twisted. A cardinal would bless the bed with holy water, praying specifically for fertility and male heirs. The language was remarkably explicit for a religious ceremony. They'd pray for the husband's potency, the wife's receptiveness, God's blessing on their sexual union, turning the most private human experience into a public prayer service, sacred and profane twisted together in service of political necessity. Some tried to resist the system, but resistance was limited. Henry IV used humour to cope. A few princes negotiated for slightly more privacy, but even small concessions required political capital and careful manoeuvring. The system was too embedded in royal protocol to change easily, and honestly, most didn't have the power to resist. When your entire identity is tied to producing legitimate heirs, you submit to whatever ensures that legitimacy, even if it destroys your dignity. The psychological damage lasted lifetimes. Royal memoirs from the 17th and 18th centuries consistently mention wedding night trauma as formative experiences. Some never recovered normal intimate relationships. Others developed elaborate coping mechanisms or turned to extramarital affairs where they could experience privacy. The system designed to ensure stable succession actually created deeply damaged individuals who struggled to form healthy relationships, including with their own children, perpetuating the trauma across generations. By the 18th century, Enlightenment ideas about individual dignity started challenging these practices. Voltaire wrote scathingly about royal bedding ceremonies, calling them barbaric rituals unworthy of civilized people. Public opinion began shifting toward viewing privacy as a basic human right, even for royalty. But change was slow because the political necessity remained. Succession disputes still meant civil wars, and consummation witnesses still prevented future challenges to legitimacy. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's wedding was one of the last fully witnessed royal beddings in French history. After the Revolution, when the monarchy briefly returned, bedding ceremonies became purely symbolic. Napoleon refused any formal bedding ceremony entirely, considering it beneath modern imperial dignity. But even then, witnesses waited outside to confirm consummation. Old habits die hard, especially when they're wrapped in centuries of legal precedent and political necessity. The practice reveals something disturbing about how power operates. When succession is everything, human dignity becomes expendable. These weren't prudish societies, they were desperately practical ones where unstable succession meant thousands of deaths in civil wars. so they sacrificed individual privacy for collective stability. But the cost was enormous. Generations of traumatized rulers, damaged relationships, and deep psychological scars that affected how they governed and related to their subjects. What's fascinating is how completely they normalized the dehumanization. Court records discuss royal beddings with the same tone they'd use for agricultural reports on livestock breeding. Clinical, practical, devoid of acknowledgement that they're discussing human beings with feelings and dignity. The system was so embedded that most participants couldn't see how twisted it was. They genuinely believed this was necessary for political stability, justifying any amount of personal trauma. The legacy lives on in subtle ways. Modern tabloids still speculate obsessively about when royal couples will produce heirs. Wedding night privacy remains partial for public figures whose personal lives affect political stability. We've moved the audience from the bedroom to the media, but the principle remains. Some people's intimate lives are considered public property because of their political importance. The trauma is less direct now, but the dehumanization continues in more sophisticated forms, from obscene to seemly. The evolution of private spaces. By the 1750s, something was shifting at Versailles. Those witnessed bedding ceremonies, people were starting to whisper they'd gone too far. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire were writing about human dignity, individual rights, personal privacy, ideas that made the old rituals look barbaric. When you've got philosophers arguing that even kings deserve intimate moments away from prying eyes, you know the world's changing. The bedroom was about to stop being a public stage. The change didn't happen overnight. It started with whispered conversations among the more progressive courtiers, letters between nobles expressing discomfort with the old ways. The Duchesse de Pompadour, Louis XV's mistress, reportedly refused to have her relationship scrutinized the way royal marriages were. She demanded privacy, not just for herself, but as a matter of principle. When the king's own mistress was setting boundaries, the message was clear: personal intimacy deserved protection. The intellectuals were brutal in their criticism. Denis Diderot wrote scathing essays about how the monarchy degraded its own members, turning human beings into breeding stock, making theatre out of what should be sacred between two people. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that forced public intimacy corrupted both participants and witnesses, that watching others in their most vulnerable moments made everyone complicit in something fundamentally wrong. These weren't just abstract philosophical debates, they had real political teeth. Marie Antoinette herself became a catalyst for change. After years of public speculation about her marriage, medical examinations, and humiliating gossip, she started pushing back, quietly at first, requesting smaller audiences for certain ceremonies, choosing her own ladies-in-waiting instead of accepting traditional appointments, creating small, private circles where she could speak freely, her famous let-them-eat-cake attitude. It wasn't just about bread, it was about refusing to live every moment under public scrutiny. The architecture of Versailles itself started changing. New royal apartments were designed with private chambers that couldn't be easily accessed by the full court, hidden staircases, secret passages, rooms where the royal family could retreat from constant observation. Louis XVI, despite his public awkwardness, was privately insisting on spaces where he could read, think, and yes, be intimate with his wife without an audience. The physical palace was adapting to new ideas about privacy. Other European courts were watching and starting their own quiet revolutions. The Austrian court, Marie Antoinette's birth family, had already begun limiting witnesses at royal bedding ceremonies. The Spanish were quietly dropping the most invasive examinations. Even the English, never known for progressive thinking, were discussing whether royal privacy might actually strengthen the monarchy rather than weaken it. The old justifications, they were crumbling across Europe. The religious establishment found itself in an awkward position. For centuries, bishops had blessed royal beds and sanctified public consummation. Now they were being asked to balance sacramental marriage with human dignity. Progressive clergy began arguing that true Christian marriage required promophy, intimacy, mutual respect, that God didn't need human witnesses to validate what he had blessed. Conservative bishops pushed back, but their theological arguments sounded increasingly hollow against Enlightenment criticism. The nobility were split down generational lines. Older courtiers clung to traditional ceremonies, insisting they protected royal legitimacy and prevented succession disputes. Younger nobles, influenced by Enlightenment reading and foreign travel, found the whole system embarrassing. They'd seen how other European courts operated with more discretion. Some threatened to boycott particularly invasive ceremonies. The social pressure was building from within the system itself, not just from outside critics. Legal scholars were raising uncomfortable questions too. Did witnessed bedding ceremonies actually provide meaningful protection against succession disputes? Court records showed that even with witnesses, royal legitimacy had been challenged repeatedly throughout French history. Maybe the whole elaborate system was just tradition masquerading as necessity. Lawyers began drafting alternative approaches to documenting royal marriages that didn't require public consummation. The practical justifications were falling apart. The 1770s marked the real turning point. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's wedding included traditional bedding ceremonies, but with notably fewer witnesses than previous generations. The couple negotiated for earlier departure of most courtiers, partial curtains instead of open beds, small symbolic gestures toward privacy that would have been unthinkable 50 years earlier. Each compromise set precedent for the next royal wedding. Change was happening incrementally, but definitely. Medical understanding was evolving too. Royal physicians began arguing that stress and public pressure could actually harm fertility, that couples needed emotional intimacy to create healthy heirs. Dr. Jean-Nicolas Corvisart, who would later treat Napoleon, wrote treatises arguing that reproductive health required privacy, comfort, and mutual affection. Science was providing new justifications for what philosophers had argued on moral grounds. The king's doctors were joining the revolution. The middle classes were creating their own standards around the same time. Wealthy merchants and professional families were developing ideas about domestic privacy that influenced royal thinking. If successful commoners could maintain dignity in their private lives, why couldn't royalty? The bourgeoisie weren't constrained by ancient court protocols. They were experimenting with new forms of family life that looked increasingly attractive to progressive nobles. Social change was bubbling up from below. By the 1780s, the old ceremonies felt not just antiquated but actively harmful to royal prestige. Instead of demonstrating power, public bedding made the monarchy look desperate, invasive, almost perverted. Foreign diplomats were writing dispatches describing French court practices as backward and embarrassing. The very rituals meant to strengthen royal authority were weakening it. Political calculation began favoring privacy over publicity for the first time in centuries. The revolution didn't just end these practices, it made them seem monstrous in retrospect. Revolutionary pamphlets described witnessed royal bedding as evidence of aristocratic depravity, proof that the monarchy had lost all connection to human decency. What had once been seen as political necessity was reframed as moral corruption. The new Republican government explicitly banned any public oversight of private, intimate life. Privacy became a revolutionary principle. When Napoleon married Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810, he completely rejected traditional bedding ceremonies, not because he respected her privacy, but because he understood that modern power required different symbols. The emperor's authority came from military genius and administrative efficiency, not from proving his virility to courtiers. He still needed legitimate heirs, but he could secure them without medieval theatre. Power was becoming more abstract, less physical. Today's royal weddings still carry traces of those old traditions. The public ceremony, the crowds, the speculation about when heirs will arrive. But the bedroom door finally closes on a private space. That transformation took centuries and cost countless individuals their dignity along the way. Privacy wasn't granted, it was fought for, argued for, slowly carved out against institutional resistance. The most intimate human moments finally became what they should have always been: personal. Impotence of privacy and power, lessons from the past. Here's what blows my mind about everything we just explored. Those French courtiers waiting outside royal bedrooms, they never really left. They just got sneakier. Today's tabloids camping outside hospitals waiting for royal birth announcements. That's the same hunger, the same belief that powerful people's private moments belong to us. We've just traded silk curtains for telephoto lenses. The tools changed. The violation didn't. And honestly, sometimes I think the old way was more honest about it. Think about William and Kate in 2011. The moment they married, the countdown started. When will they have kids? How many? Is Kate pregnant yet? Every public appearance got analysed for baby bumps. Sound familiar? It's Marie Antoinette all over again, minus the actual witnesses in the bedroom, but the pressure's identical. Produce heirs, prove the marriage works, keep the bloodline going. The public still believes royal reproduction is their business. We just pretend we're more civilized about it now. We're not. Remember when Meghan Markle was constantly photographed holding her belly, or when Kate's morning sickness made international headlines? That's modern bedding ceremony witness behavior. We can't physically stand outside their bedroom anymore, so we scrutinize every photo, every public appearance, every medical appointment. The same desperate need to know, to confirm, to participate in royal reproduction. The monarchy trained us for centuries to believe this was normal. Now we can't turn it off.
Here's the twisted part. Those French courtiers at least had official roles. They were there by law, by tradition, serving a political function. Today's royal watchers, we just want to know. No official reason, no political necessity, pure curiosity mixed with entitlement. We've kept the invasion but lost the justification. At least Marie Antoinette knew why people were watching her. Modern royals get stalked by millions for entertainment. That might actually be worse. The technology changed everything and nothing. Versailles courtiers had to physically be there, limiting the audience to a few dozen witnesses. Now millions can participate in royal privacy violations simultaneously. Every pregnancy speculation article gets shared globally. Every paparazzi photo of a royal couple on vacation reaches more people than lived in all of France in 1770. We've democratized the bedding ceremony, made everyone a potential witness. The scale is terrifying. What gets me is how we've convinced ourselves this is different. It's news, we say. They're public figures. They signed up for this. But did they? William was born into it. Harry was born into it. Their wives married into something they couldn't fully understand until they lived it. Marie Antoinette at least knew what she was agreeing to when she married the Dauphin. Modern royal brides get surprised by the level of invasion. Nobody really prepares you for global scrutiny. The old system was brutal but bounded. Royal bedding ceremonies happened once per marriage, maybe repeated if the first didn't take. Today's version never ends. Every anniversary becomes speculation about children. Every public appearance gets analysed for relationship health. Every vacation photo becomes evidence of marital success or failure. The witnesses never go home, they just multiply. The ceremony became permanent, following royals everywhere they go. Privacy doesn't exist. Diana changed everything by talking about it openly. She broke the code of silence, admitted the pressure was crushing her. Suddenly we could see behind the curtain, and instead of backing off, we leaned in harder. Her honesty made us more invasive, not less. We learned royal marriages could be unhappy, so now we scrutinize every interaction for signs of trouble. Diana's transparency backfired spectacularly. She tried to reclaim privacy by sharing truth. It just made us hungrier. Harry and Meghan's escape attempt proves the point perfectly. They literally fled to another continent, quit royal duties, gave up titles, and we followed them. The tabloids didn't respect the boundary, neither did the public. Their privacy lawsuit victories feel Pyrrhic because for every photo they stop, 10 more get published. You can't outrun institutional voyeurism that's been building for centuries. The system's bigger than any individual royal family member. The French Revolution ended royal bedding ceremonies by ending the monarchy, but the hunger survived. We transferred it to celebrities, then back to surviving royals, then to anyone famous enough to generate clicks. The same basic human urge that made courtiers wait outside Louis XVI's bedroom now makes people refresh celebrity Instagram accounts obsessively. We've just distributed the voyeurism more efficiently. Everyone can be a witness now. Everyone can participate in the violation. Modern royal children get it worst. George, Charlotte, Louis, their privacy gets invaded before they can walk. At least historical royal children lived relatively normal childhoods until marriage age. Now every school drop-off becomes a photo opportunity. Every playground moment gets captured and analysed. We've extended the bedding ceremony logic to their entire lives. Nothing is sacred, nothing is private. The throne comes with lifetime surveillance from birth to death. The economic incentive makes it unstoppable. Those French courtiers witnessed royal consummation for political stability. Today's photographers and tabloid writers do it for money. Millions of dollars ride on exclusive royal pregnancy announcements, wedding photos, family moments. The profit motive turned everyone into potential courtiers. Every person with a phone camera becomes a possible witness. Every interaction becomes monetizable content. Capitalism weaponized the old system. Social media amplified everything beyond recognition. Historical royal watching required physical presence or official court access. Now anyone can speculate publicly about royal pregnancies, relationships, parenting choices. Twitter threads analyzing Kate's body language during public appearances get millions of views. Reddit communities dedicated to royal pregnancy speculation have hundreds of thousands of members. We've created global participation in royal surveillance. Versailles courtiers were amateurs compared to modern royal watchers. The saddest part, modern royals can't even rebel effectively. Marie Antoinette could retreat to the Petit Trianon, create private spaces within the system. Today's royals have no refuge. Satellites can photograph their private residences. Paparazzi use drones. Long-lens cameras capture moments from miles away. The Trianon was bulldozed by technology. There's nowhere to hide, no way to create genuine privacy. The fishbowl became inescapable. The price of power became total exposure. What we've learned is disturbing but important. Power and privacy are fundamentally incompatible in human societies. We'll always want to watch powerful people's private moments. Technology just makes us more efficient violators of boundaries. The French courtiers at least served a governmental function. We stalk royals for entertainment, then convince ourselves it's democratic accountability. It's not. It's the same old hunger dressed up in modern justification. The watchers never went away. They just got better cameras. So next time you see royal pregnancy speculation, or wedding gossip, remember where it comes from. Those impulses stretch back centuries to French bedrooms where terrified teenagers performed intimacy for political stability. We inherited the system without the justification, kept the invasion, lost the purpose. Maybe recognizing that history could help us choose differently, or maybe not. The hunger seems too deep, too old, too profitable to stop now. Sweet dreams knowing your bedroom stays private. Lights out. Final reflections on royal intimacy in public. Here we are at the end of this strange journey through French royal bedchambers. And honestly, the more you think about it, the more twisted it gets. These weren't medieval barbarians. These were some of the most sophisticated, cultured people in Europe. They wrote poetry, patronized the arts, built Versailles, yet they turned wedding nights into public performances. How do you reconcile that? How do you explain a civilization that could create sublime beauty but couldn't grant basic human dignity to their own rulers? The central paradox runs deeper than you might think. Privacy, the thing we take for granted, it literally didn't exist for French royalty. Not just on their wedding nights. Never. They ate in public, dressed in public, even died in public. Their bodies belonged to the state before they belonged to themselves. And this created something we can barely imagine. Human beings who never experienced solitude, never had a moment that was truly theirs alone. Think about that. When was the last time you were completely, utterly alone? They never were. The tradition evolved in fascinating ways across centuries. Early medieval kings, their bedding ceremonies were brutal, almost tribal. Fast forward to Louis XIV, it became choreographed theatre, with specific roles for everyone present. By Marie Antoinette's time, there were actual protocols, written instructions, who stood where, what they could observe, what they couldn't. The French took a primitive political necessity and turned it into elaborate court ritual. They made surveillance into art. That's kind of impressive, in a deeply disturbing way. Only the French, right? The psychological damage was real and lasting. Marie Antoinette's letters reveal years of therapy-worthy trauma from her wedding night humiliation. She was 14. Imagine being 14 and having your most intimate moment watched, evaluated, gossiped about the next morning at breakfast. Louis XVI never recovered from his early sexual failures being court knowledge. Some historians argue his later political weakness stemmed partly from bedroom humiliation. When your private shame becomes public entertainment, it changes you, breaks something inside that never quite heals. Different courts handled this differently, which tells us something important. English royalty had bedding ceremonies but less invasive ones. Spanish court was actually more brutal than French. They required physical proof, medical examinations. But the French, they perfected the art of making it ceremonial while still completely violating. They found ways to make surveillance feel dignified. That takes a special kind of cultural sophistication, or maybe just centuries of practice at justifying the unjustifiable. Either way, they were uniquely good at it. Politics and bedroom merged in ways we can barely comprehend today. Every royal pregnancy was a diplomatic event. Every miscarriage shifted European balance of power. When queens couldn't conceive, wars started over succession disputes. The Spanish Succession War, the War of Austrian Succession. These weren't abstract political conflicts. They happened because royal couples failed to produce male heirs. Millions died because someone's bedroom performance disappointed their courtiers. The most intimate human act became the most public political statement. That's insane when you really think about it. The Enlightenment slowly changed everything. Suddenly philosophers were writing about individual dignity, personal liberty, the right to privacy. Voltaire, Rousseau, they didn't directly attack royal bedding ceremonies, but their ideas made them seem barbaric, old-fashioned, embarrassing. By 1770, even court observers were becoming uncomfortable with the whole thing. Marie Antoinette's wedding night was one of the last full-scale witness consummations in European history. Not because anyone planned it that way, because the ideas that supported these practices were crumbling. Philosophy killed the royal bedding ceremony more effectively than any revolution. The end came suddenly. Revolutionary France abolished the monarchy entirely, obviously ending royal bedding ceremonies along with everything else. But even when the Bourbons returned after Napoleon, they couldn't bring back the old practices. The world had moved on. Napoleon himself refused any bedding ceremony when he married Marie Louise of Austria in 1810, called it beneath imperial dignity, which is hilarious, considering everything else Napoleon was willing to do for power. But even he understood that some traditions were too humiliating to revive. Some bridges couldn't be uncrossed. What does this tell us about power? Here's the thing. Absolute power didn't free these kings and queens. It imprisoned them. The more powerful they became, the less privacy they enjoyed. The higher their status, the more their bodies belonged to everyone else. True power might actually be the opposite. The ability to close your door and know nobody's listening, to make mistakes privately, to be human without an audience. French royalty had everything except the one thing that might have mattered most, the power to be alone. The human cost was staggering when you add it all up. Centuries of royal couples traumatized on their wedding nights, children born into goldfish bowl existence, teenagers forced into marriages they couldn't escape or even consummate privately. We focus on the political necessity, preventing succession wars, validating alliances. But think about the actual people involved. Girls undressed by strangers, teenage boys performing under pressure while courtiers waited outside. These weren't abstract political figures. They were human beings, and they suffered for our entertainment, for political stability that often failed anyway. How did ordinary people view this? Contemporary accounts suggest most French citizens found royal bedding ceremonies normal, expected even. They understood why succession needed witnesses, but they also gossiped mercilessly about royal sexual failures. Marie Antoinette's delayed pregnancies became street songs. Louis XVI's impotence was discussed in taverns across France. The same system that claimed to protect royal dignity through public ceremony actually destroyed it through public humiliation. The people who were supposed to benefit from stable succession instead mocked their rulers' bedroom failures. Another beautiful French paradox. The psychological impact lasted generations. Royal memoirs from the 18th and 19th centuries obsess over wedding night trauma. It shaped how these people approached intimacy for life. Some became sexually compulsive, trying to prove themselves. Others withdrew entirely, associating physical intimacy with public humiliation. Many struggled with relationships because they'd never learned what privacy felt like. When your first sexual experience happens with an audience, it changes your relationship with your own body, with trust, with vulnerability. These weren't just political ceremonies, they were psychological torture sessions that created damaged people. Modern echoes still exist, which is unsettling. Royal couples today face intense public scrutiny about when they'll have children. Every pregnancy announcement becomes front-page news. Tabloids speculate about royal bedroom problems. We've supposedly evolved beyond medieval barbarism, yet we still treat royal reproduction as public entertainment. The cameras stay outside the bedroom now, but the expectation remains. Royal couples exist partly to provide us with heirs and entertainment. We've gained enough decency to grant physical privacy while maintaining psychological violation. Progress, I guess. The contrast with today's privacy expectations is stark. We consider bedroom surveillance the ultimate violation. Revenge porn is criminal. Non-consensual intimate recordings destroy lives and careers. We've built elaborate legal protections around sexual privacy because we understand how fundamental it is to human dignity. Yet for centuries, European society considered royal bedroom surveillance not just acceptable, but necessary. Political necessity trumped human dignity so completely that nobody questioned it. That should make us think about what seemingly normal practices today might horrify future generations. I find myself feeling genuine sympathy for these historical figures. Not because they were royalty, because they were human beings trapped in an impossible system. Marie Antoinette didn't choose to be born an Austrian archduchess. Louis XVI didn't volunteer for public sexual performance at 15. They inherited circumstances that guaranteed humiliation. Their most vulnerable moments became state ceremonies. Their private failures became public entertainment. Yes, they lived in luxury, but they paid for it with something precious: the right to fail privately, to be human without an audience, to close the bedroom door. Tonight, as you fall asleep in your own private space, remember what a luxury that is. For most of human history, privacy was impossible for those in power. French royalty lived in golden cages, where even lovemaking required an audience. They gave up the most basic human dignity, solitude, for political stability that often failed anyway. Your bedroom door that locks, your moments alone, your right to be intimate without witnesses. These aren't just conveniences, they're revolutions. They're victories over a world that once believed some people's bodies belonged to everyone else. Sleep well in your privacy.